Okie dokie. Hello, everyone. It's the 10th of March. Welcome to Dis and Dat, 5 p.m. Yes, we had a time change this past weekend in the United States. I know that Europe, I think, is springing forward or falling back, but maybe not all of Europe, probably parts of Europe, which is always confusing, and I've been there before. What I'm going to talk about today is to include a book that I have yet to complete reading. And so I'm working with fragments of it on the one hand. I'm working also with a article that I find really interesting and useful for stuff I'm doing anyway. And I think it'll be useful for your amusement as well, because it is a kind of critique of the network state. The network state comes from a book written in 2022. It is the kind of basis for many, like Peter Thiel and a bunch of the other crazoids, uh, it sort of articulates better what Mencius Moldbug had in mind for these relatively autonomous charter cities and blah, blah, blah. The essentially Silicon Valley libertarianism of one kind or another, seeking autonomy with a more technical element. It's essentially dirty fucking hippies with computers, which may be a contradiction. That's sort of an oxymoron, I suppose, because there still are uh, anti-technological alternate culture types. But anyway, I found this great quote. Whenever libertarians start fantasizing about alternatives to government, they just come up with government. There was a comment made about about this whole business. So there's an article called "If the News is Fake, Imagine History: The Network State and the Second Bourgeois Revolution" by Joel Z. Garrod, Garrod. It's in Progress in Economic Geography of last year, 2024. So it's within the last year, probably in terms of editing, etc. And of course, all the right names are part of this. So I'll just read the abstract, the first kind of part, and then the conclusion. And then, if I have time, I'll read from the book itself by Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote the original Network State book, which is free. It's available online. Um, it's written in text, so it has a certain quasi-academic look to it on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not anything new or earth-shaking. It's simply, well, you'll see. So I included a little of his 1,000-word, I think, summary or synopsis. I guess you can do 1,000 words in an elevator. If well, anyway. Abstract, written by Balaji Srinivasan, founder of genetic testing firm Counsyl, Counsyl, former general partner and Andreessen, remember, Horowitz, and former CTO of Coinbase. There you go, crypto, with close connections to anti-democratic tech billionaire Peter Thiel. The network state imagines a new state form grounded in blockchain technology after first situating the text within longer genealogies of neoliberalism, authoritarian freedom, and libertarian exit. The exit concepts are actually very important. The entry exit business, it's political, stuff. I then overturned the book's central premise. That is, that exit to the digital frontier via network states will increase human freedom. And that fundamental idea, that's an important, claim or argument in highlighting how societies dominated by private property restrict human freedom by forcing the many to exchange their labor power to the few to survive. I argue that the creation of zones like the network state are instead a reflection of our epoch's major dynamic. That is, the attempt to shift the rights of capital and the authority over those rights to the transnational level. In contrast to those that see zones as part of an emerging neo-feudalism, I conclude that the network state is better understood as a legitimating text for a second bourgeois revolution. Now, that's sort of the grand model of what counts as a bourgeois revolution relative to uh, the mode of production called capitalism. And it's pretty clear that bourgeois revolutions happen all the time. Well, not happen all the time, but they are part of the kind of the overall kind of sweep of history. In historical materialism, you could claim that while there may be one big bourgeois revolution, there are lots of little bourgeois revolutions moving about. You could say that the French state, for example, goes through many little bourgeois revolutions, or well, you could argue that anyway. And it's fine. The question is the difference between what is a bourgeois revolution and what other things might be, and that is a proletarian revolution, also the role of the state, etc., the role of a ruling class, the role of a lumpen proletariat, etc. All right, first section, the rapid proliferation of global computer-based networks and the digitization of a broad array of economic and political activities that now can circulate in these networks raise questions about the effectiveness of current framings for state authority and democratic participation. In a context of multiple, partial, and specific changes linked to globalization, these forms of digitization have remained the ascendants of subnational scales, such as the global city, and supranational scales, such as global markets, where previously the national scale was dominant. These rescalings do not always parallel existing formalizations of state authority. And if you haven't read Saskia Sassen, you should. It's very important, just in the bigger question of, global social movements and et cetera. Once we remember that Facebook has 3 billion plus users, Twitter has 300 million plus, and many individual influencers have 1 million plus followers, it starts to be not too crazy to imagine that we can build a 1 to 10 million person startup society with a genuine sense of national consciousness, an integrated cryptocurrency, and a plan to crowdfund many pieces of territory around the world. With the internet, we can digitally sew these disjoint enclaves together into a new kind of polity that achieves diplomatic recognition, a network state. And that's a quote from Balaji Srinivasan. And a quote from Gary Keeple. The future will not bring a neoliberal paradise of free buyers and sellers, however. There will be, rather, a continuous growth of the global system of enormous social and economic inequalities that already exists, a natural consequence of the more or less unrestrained accumulation of capitalist private property. So I will begin with our fellow Garad, Joel Z. Garad's work here, but let me, those quotes are important quotes, interesting quotes, and we all have our own little sense of how these things happen. For me, it's quite more visceral. That is, libertarians, their particular difference is this dependence on private property or on property rights in general, and it's always about, we want to have everyone to have individual rights, but don't touch my stuff. And that's pretty much the theory in a nutshell. But anyway, Garad's work. Introduction number 1. In an article exploring the positioning of different groups who aim to use blockchain technology to transform the property relations of capitalism, I conclude by noting that it is more exciting to talk about the future of blockchain technology. We are in an imaginative period where its application is not yet entirely entrenched in our everyday lives, creating a pause for us to use the blockchain as a lens through which to examine our relative freedom and the means by which we're empowered and controlled. It is a perfect moment to imagine alternative futures. The Network State, the book, attempts to do just that. written by Balaji Srinivasan, founder of genetic testing firm Counsel, former general partner in Andreessen Horowitz, and former CTO of Coinbase with close connections to anti-democratic tech billionaire Peter Thiel. The network state imagines a new state form grounded in blockchain technology as part of a larger trend of techno-optimism in which market capitalism and technology will solve the world's problems. Srinivasan argues that through the use of cryptographic protocols, the network state will be able to protect freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of contract, prevention from discrimination and cancellation via pseudonymity, individual privacy, and truly equal protection under rule of code as opposed to rule of law, as well as ensure the choice to leave or enter is demonstrably free and uncoerced. If you've been on Twitter, none of that happens. By first deconstructing the establishment's history in one specific area, erecting a replacement narrative in its place, then proving the socioeconomic value of that one commandment by using it to attract subscriber citizens. Srinivasan sees these parallel startup societies, unlike a startup company, right, as transforming into network unions and then network archipelagos that put their subscribers' capital to work to secure land before eventually becoming diplomatically recognized network states that coordinate all the functions of a state across the borders of legacy nation states. Featured prominently in publications like Forbes, the Financial Times, and Wired, among influential blogs, podcasts, and YouTube videos, the response to the book has been varied, with some praising it for discussing the notion of a digital state and others critiquing it for its solutionist and anti-democratic themes, as well as its lack of academic references and lack of details about how network states might function in the real world. In this respect, the response to the book follows the response to blockchain technology more generally, where scholars frequently highlight why the relational aspects of money and exchange make blockchain-mediated, trustless utopias unlikely to come to pass. Central to many blockchain critiques is the contradiction between the anti-democratic language used to discuss the technology and supporters' claims that it will challenge corporate power and decentralize freedom. And following the same line of critique, that's an oxymoron, right? Decentralizing freedom. But anyway, in following the same line of critique, scholars examining the network state treat it as a new digital form of older, failed libertarian attempts to exit the nation state, with similar results presumed to follow. These scholars are right to suggest that network states are unlikely to emerge in the same way that Srinivasan suggests, but the strength of the book resides in its allure rather than its viability. Imagined and invented worlds express fears and yearnings that are rooted in current discontents, either signaling possible escape routes or painting in morbid colors the horrific consequences of heedlessness in the present. Unquote. At their core, they're visions of how to reorganize property relations, that is, the rights in or to things that, number one, define and structure the dominant relationships between people and things. Number two, inform the nature of governance and state institutions. And number three, delimit the spatial boundaries of rights and their enforcement. And there's some good authors listed under that. Blomley, for example, who is like one of the leading lights of legal geography, for example. Understood as such, property relations are constitutive of state forms, enabling us to use property as a means of tracking their transformation through the empirical examination of the sorts of rights they enforce and defend, how they enforce them, and the specific areas over which those rights extend. See feudalism. We can also use property to judge whether particular actors have too much power and whether or not they should. Assessing the outcome of any system of property relations is thus to make a judgment call on one of the most fundamental aspects of living together as social beings. It means having the ability to see where we're going and whether that's a desirable direction. Given the ways in which particular images or stories about property have historically been used to validate and conceal class interests, one of the major tasks of the social scientist is to understand what sort of work a property concept is doing when it seems to acquire a new amplitude, as it does in the network state, where it underpins a vision of an entirely new state form. As one of the few book-length works to sketch an outline of the sort of decentralized autonomous societies that blockchain supporters have long dreamed of, the network state book provides a unique case study to explore, number one, whether the possible escape routes suggested by the property relations in the book are somewhere where we would actually want to go. And number two, what the text reflects about contemporary struggles over property, of which the blockchain is a significant part. In seeing the network state as a likely to fail libertarian exit project, I argue that we're led to ignore the more abstract ways in which the text shares an elective affinity with a larger and more generalized struggle to make a global property regime. The network state should thus be read along the lines of other contemporary right-wing projects, such as the neo-reactionary, that is the NRX movement, NR capital N, capital R, a lowercase x movement, in which the aim is not feasibility, but rather dreaming of a certain kind, but not called ideology. While many of these texts, including the network state, have been dismissed as outlandish or batshit crazy, their striking influence on contemporary politics and their widespread visibility make them necessary objects of critique and engagement. As Ross 2017 notes, combating fascism requires the bravery and courage of facts. After first situating the network state within longer genealogies of authoritarian freedom and libertarian exit, I overturn the book's central premise that exit to the digital frontier via network states will increase human freedom. In highlighting how societies dominated by private property restrict human freedom by forcing the many to exchange their labor power to the few to survive, that's Soren Mao's book reference there, I argue that the creation of zones like the network state are not simply tools of the state, as Slobodian suggests, but are instead reflective of our epoc's major dynamic, that is, the attempt to shift the rights of capital and the authority over those rights to the transnational level. The focus on whether a network state will succeed in the future risks missing how present tense neoliberal conditions allow for globalizing capital to flourish, and the ways in which the nation state itself facilitates and mediates the exit of a transnational capitalist class. The beliefs and dreams captured in Srinivasan's text have already expedited the changing landscape of global property regimes, where capital accumulation can increasingly intensify. In this sense, the Srinivasan brand of escape imagines blockchain technology as another enabling conduit to accumulate capital unabated by current formations of property rights enshrined and enforced, or not, by the nation state. See crypto. I conclude by briefly addressing scholarship that finds resonance between feudalism and our present epoch by arguing that conceptions of neo-feudalism, right, techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism fall short of recognizing texts like the network state as a legitimating narrative, however flawed, for a second bourgeois revolution, imagining a time and place more hospitable for already existing forms of accumulation, exit, and authority. Now, this is the second part here is I've skipped all the stuff in between, which is actually quite good. But I'm going to go to the conclusion because, the best to skip to the see whether the butler did it. Conclusion. Although it's typical for commentators to dismiss Srinivasan, treating him as a clown, as Turan notes, Donald Trump taught us that clowns can be dangerous. In treating the network state as just another unrealistic right wing fantasy that ignores historical and material realities, we fail to locate it as a deeper reflection of our neoliberalized, financialized, and globalized age, the political embodiment of a period constituted by the democratization of making money off assets. As part of a global dynamic of accumulation that is attempting to extend private property rights outwards across national territories and inward into new domains, the network state book is a politico ideological reflection of a movement already underway working to normalize the view that the only safe and orderly future is a global, blockchain mediated capitalism without democracy, serving up the cause of the current crisis as the solution. To conclude, we might consider why Srinivasan, like the NRX, goes to all this trouble just to twist the basic facts. In an age where the failures of neoliberalism are on full display, the Network State book reflects the broader goal as seen in the rise of right wing ideology to prevent, quote, contemporary crisis from inducing a systemic transformation away from neoliberal globalization and the capitalist mode of production. Fascism, as Walter Benjamin once pointed out, gives the masses expression while preserving property. It is a means of securing capitalist property relations when confronted by alternative forces. When this occurs, as Draper notes, the film of bourgeois development unwinds in a reverse direction. The freedoms that the liberal bourgeoisie once demanded are cut back. Popular institutions are doctored so as to interpose a maximum of impediments between the institutions and popular pressures from below. This is why, recalling Marx's famous phrase from the 18th Brumaire, that history repeats itself first as tragedy, the second as farce. We now see attempted coups by former reality TV stars and attempts to staff key government positions with people that don't believe in the state and its institutions. Tile, as part of Trump's transition team, for instance, tried to get Srinivasan placed as the head of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, to shut it down. In a recent podcast, Srinivasan makes the links to fascism even clearer, suggesting that citizens loyal to tech companies wear gray T-shirts to identify themselves. I better get some. Fund weekly police banquets and test police loyalty by asking them, did you want to take the sign off of Elon's building? Now, if they answer correctly, Srinivasan suggests rewarding their entire family with jobs at tech companies. You better remember this little script, right? While the imagery is a little on the nose in terms of fascist aesthetics, it serves to channel popular frustrations with the incapacity of the liberal democratic state to deal with crisis or serve as a site of social reform. Torn between the need to promote transnational capital accumulation in their territories and their need to achieve political legitimacy, the center cannot hold. And everywhere, trust in liberal democratic institutions is in decline. In the face of climate change and the crisis of humanity before us, I'm reminded of Fitting's prescient warning about all right-wing utopias. These works should serve to remind us that even the modest liberal gains that have been made over the past few decades are under attack. Perhaps we should read them as we read the dystopia as warnings of what the future holds if we fail to resist. Whether private property is enforced as a decentralized form of rule, the concentration and centralization of capital necessarily concentrates and centralizes power, and without political or social rights to mitigate this power, there is only increased domination. The GovCore that they are attempting to bring into fruition already exists in the science fiction of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, or Marge Piercy's He, She, It, but they're not treated as an escape from a tyrannous state. Rather, they are a place that one chooses to go under duress, accepting the loss of rights as a necessary exchange for safety and security in the wasteland. Let us continue to resist the making of right-wing utopias into right-wing realities. Okay, you've heard all my other yammering about this. It's pretty clear that there's some people, if given the power, will create, gated right-wing cities, even in California. The Presidios are the perfect place to do it, in fact. I mean, it already has bunkers on it, so, it's pretty much ahead of the game. Anyway, this is a useful article because I think one needs to have these tools to be able to talk about, well, what's really going on here. It is about property. It still is about capital, ultimately. Um, and one needs to resist what are, clearly ideologically driven fantasies that are the result of, organized false consciousness and are anti-democratic, barbarous in many ways. Okay, so I include the link to the book itself, The Network State: How to Start a New Country by Balaji Srinivasan, and I'll just read from the front end here. It is 1,000 words, and this shows a certain amount of discipline, I suppose, that that you can sort of put this together. It is, as I said, like an elevator talk, and if you do it fast enough, you can probably get people to believe you. A network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. A network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an online census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. Now, you can make this claim for what? San Marino, Monaco, Montenegro, Luxembourg, whatever. These are already extant, but they haven't gone to the next level. That is, which is, I think, what Srinivasan's trying to do. The network state in 1,000 words. Technology has allowed us to start new companies, new communities, and new currencies, but can we use it to create new cities or even new countries? A key concept is to go cloud first, land last, but not land never, by starting with an online community and then materializing it into the physical world. We get there in 7 steps. Step 1. Found a startup society. This is simply an online community with aspirations of something greater. Anyone can found one, just like anyone can found a company or a cryptocurrency, and the founder's legitimacy comes from whether people opt to follow them. 2, organize it into a group capable of collective action. Given a sufficiently dedicated online community, the next step is to organize it into a network union. Unlike a social network, a network union has a purpose. It coordinates its members for their mutual benefit. And unlike a traditional union, a network union is not set up solely in opposition to a particular corporation, so it can take a variety of different collective actions. That is, of course, if you believe that that's what unions really do. Unionization is a key step because it turns an otherwise ineffective online community into a group of people working together for a common cause. Number 3, step 3, build trust offline and a crypto economy online. Begin holding in-person meetups in the physical world of increasing scale and duration while simultaneously building an internal economy using cryptocurrency. Step 4, crowdfund physical nodes. Once sufficient trust has been built and funds have been accumulated, start crowdfunding apartments, houses, and even towns to bring digital citizens into the physical world within real co-living communities. Number 5, digitally connect physical communities. Link these physical nodes together into a network archipelago, a set of digitally connected physical territories distributed around the world. Nodes of the network archipelago range from one-person apartments to in-person communities of arbitrary size. Physical access is granted by holding a Web3 crypto passport, and mixed reality is used to seamlessly link the online and offline worlds. Step 6, conduct an on-chain census. As the society scales, run a cryptographically auditable census to demonstrate the growing size of your population, income, and real estate footprint. This is how a startup society proves traction in the face of skepticism. Step 7, gain diplomatic recognition. A startup society with sufficient scale should eventually be able to negotiate for diplomatic recognition from at least one pre-existing government. This is where the Ponzi scheme starts. And from there, gradually increased sovereignty, slowly becoming a true network state. The key idea is to populate the land from the cloud and to do so all over the earth. Unlike an ideologically disaligned and geographically centralized legacy state, which packs millions of disputants in one place, a network state is ideologically aligned but geographically decentralized. The people are spread around the world in clusters of varying size, but their hearts are in one place. In Pyongyang. Yeah. Anyway, if a startup begins by identifying an economic problem in today's market and presenting a technologically informed solution to that problem in the form of a new company, a startup society begins by identifying a moral issue in today's culture and presenting a historically informed solution to that issue in the form of a new society. And then he just yammers on here about some of the myths of uh, technology culture and some similar beliefs about, and a very simplified version of what counts as ideological positions of left versus right. And of course, libertarians are the superiors in this one thing. So if you get to the end, you might actually start believing that you could do this. And I think this is fine as long as I was in charge, right? I'm happy to, because that's the kind of ego exercise I think that this involves. It doesn't really quite accommodate the questions of what truly collective action means, because collective action is also about discourse, and in some ways they're trying to limit that by a certain strictures defined in effect by the technology and property. So there's that. I included an additional article, To Live and Die for the Network State. This is, I think, it's 2022. And at times the book feels less like a book and more like a Wikipedia page. It's not clear to me how you'd even read it in printed form, which perhaps why there isn't one. The most interesting section, the titular concept. Well, with all due respect, you could create a network state, but to what end? And if it is defined by property, that is capital, it has also other elements that leverage power within that particular context. And so governance is not wholly democratic. It's an anti-democratic construction. In other words, the richest people in your network state there would be class war eventually. So, and also I include another article from last year on a philosophical critique of network states. And It is about the legal questions, which I think is where it lies. This property question is also an ethical question. The following article is an analysis of the network state and asks the following: what makes an ethical network state? If network states replace nation states, they must have some moral or ethical foundation. This article argues that a network state is ethical only if it holds human autonomy as its principal end. The first section is concerned with formulating a rough historical context of this discussion, and the rest will be an answer to the question of what makes an ethical state. So, in other words, the arguments, and this is an extension, of course, of there's some really good texts on libertarianism that talk about this on the questions of governance or self-governance, and I think those are important ones to include within the context of ethics. So I'll read a portion from this because I think it's important in using Benedict Anderson's book Imagined Communities, which I think is a very useful idea, one that tries to address some new left questions on the same issue about, what constitutes a nationalism or, certain types of consciousness. And it's really important because we have exactly this imagined question or the imagination question, something that Eric Hobsbawm has talked about when talking about invention or imagined communities in his own way. As capitalism became the new economic system, replacing the old feudal guilds and their small and inefficient means of production, cultural conditions began to take hold that would give rise to nations and a sense of national consciousness. This thesis, argued in great detail by Benedict Anderson in his book Imagined Communities, is characteristically similar to Marxist theory, which generally holds that any difference made in a society's economic and technological base results in changes throughout its whole structure. As humans alter their environment, gain control of its variables, and reduce the severity of their conditions, higher, more rational faculties may begin to develop. Marx writes, by thus acting on the external world and changing it, human beings at the same time change their own nature. As technology progresses, as the tools used by human beings advance and become more efficient and productive, human consciousness grows with it. Starting with primitive forms of productive forces like stone tools, human beings organize themselves in ways made possible by this primal mode of technology, which possesses a meager capacity to tame and alter nature, and consequently casts human understanding and knowledge into the shadows, greatly obstructing their freedom as well as their capacity to become self-aware. Thus, as the means of production progress, more complicated forms of social organization become possible. Human beings slowly become conscious of their autonomy, the ability to live a life dictated by reason, by rational choice and principle, and not by the caprice of external causal factors. Throughout this historical process, the old institutions and societal structures deteriorate and grow obsolete. Revolutions occur to update the social infrastructure and catch up to the progressing economic base. When technology grew to the point of being able to sustain capitalism and more well-organized systems of labor were needed to support the economy's demands, people flocked to the cities, leaving behind the rural life that was characteristic of the feudal system, and began thinking of themselves as part of larger collectives, well, perhaps as nations. Marx writes, independent, or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. And industrialization then and its new tools, which drastically shift the means of production, changed human consciousness, and laid the conditions necessary for societies to become nation states. In Imagined Communities, Anderson claims this development towards industrialization and nation states was largely set in motion by the advent of the Gutenberg printing press in 1440. 1435, actually. But anyway, he argues that this technology, which began to distribute newspapers, novels, and Bibles to readers in a language that become a people's common vernacular, vernacular language, had laid the cultural conditions for a sense of national consciousness, the feeling that one belonged to a larger community that expanded past their immediate surroundings to come about. People who previously did not think of themselves as French, English, or American, who spoke in largely discontinuous dialects, slowly began to think of themselves as participating in a nation of people bound together by a shared experience. These new national identities replaced the old, religious, preordained orders that once provided meanings to human beings, and nationality became one of the more dominant modes through which people identified who and what were. Now, another important technology that facilitated the historical development of nations was the ledger and its use for double entry bookkeeping. Yes, we're back at double entry bookkeeping again. So, anyway, this continues on here. I'm getting to the end of my time. And essentially, today, with the invention of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, many believe that these current institutions have become obsolete and that new forms of social organization are needed. In his book, Balaji Srinivasan labors to demonstrate this point, arguing that the network and its capacity to allow individuals to organize digital, landless communities can replace the old nation states that obstruct social development. And particularly believes blockchain and its capacity to underpin trustless systems to be capable of supplanting the older institutions by automating what they were entrusted with doing. Cryptocurrencies can automate the roles done by central banks and the Federal Reserve. Information of news and events can be loaded into blockchains and remain immutable, preventing self serving parties from tampering and manipulating it for their interests. Private information can be cryptographically secured and held by individuals rather than by centralized private tech companies like Google. And nation states more generally can be superseded by the network, which eliminates the perennial issue of land that has caused innumerable wars and conflicts between sovereign states. But despite the optimism induced by these new technologies, there are problems. So the question that she raises is that the rest of this article will address what it means for a network state to be ethical, to use the term of Srinivasan. Some nation states are viewed as unethical, as providing conditions that are degrading to human beings, and North Korea immediately comes to mind. The next section will propose a way to discern what makes this judgment and others like it to be true, and will be used to assess what a network state must achieve to be considered ethical. Now, I she will argue that this can only be done by holding people's autonomy as the principal end of the state. And I don't disagree with that. I think that the protection of that autonomy is really important. And unfortunately, um, when you see Elon and his little tech boys wander into a federal agency, they don't really give a crap about people's autonomy. So anyway, there are good ideas here. I think that our discussion of it has been, problematic, of course, as it always is. But I hope that you'll take a few moments to stare at this, at least, and come up with your own better opinions. And we have addressed this here, and I hope that we continue to have these kinds of conversations because it's really important. Um, Yes, I do think that these are all important. And Greenland is a classic example. I mean, if you're a tech boy, you can sort of think, oh, there are only 60,000 people there, or 57,000, and only 40,000 of them actually vote or whatever. Um, you know, we should be able to just either move everybody out of the country, which is what happened in Ukraine, or and put in new people or whatever. There's just other things that people probably think and are quite draconian on this. Um, so thank you for that comment, Anna. And fancy online census shows that people are leaving within like 2 months when they face reality. And collective action, as I said, yes, collective action, it means a lot more than simply organizing people. It's very cultural in that particular sense, way, way problematic. So I hope that people will take advantage of such articles. There are enough now to actually have a reasonable conversation if you come up against any person who's been reading some of this malarkey. And um, as Kelly sort of points out, that Uh, I don't think that the Heritage Foundation would buy into this. They're much more interested in the fascist, takeover of everything, and they don't really give a crap. I think they assume that technology is a black box. It's more than that, and particularly the idea that blockchain presents is in some ways a really a at one level a good idea. On the other level, has no infrastructure in order to support that idea, which is still lacking. And of course, at the front end, it's similar to, as I've said, Blanquism. That now that they've seized power, they're just going to do whatever the hell they want and screw whether it's democratic or not. So that's kind of what's going on. Um, Now, the idea, the concept of a network state is a good idea, but you have to get everyone to, on the one hand, surrender or else agree to certain uniform ethical questions. And pretty hard when, women are not supposed to be educated in some countries in the world, and a lot of countries in the world, where marriages are arranged in a majority of countries on the planet, and relative to population, and other such stuff. Um, so yes, Anna, I do think that it'll be like a little libertarian charter city thing, a freedom city. Gaza will become a free. It won't be named Gaza anymore. Maybe they'll call it New Gaza or New and Improved Gaza. Or Super Gaza or something. Anyway, I wax philosophic or something. So let me stop here, shut off the live stream.